systems. And food is, obviously a very important way and one of the most, prominent ways that humans interact with other species. But you start getting into interesting things as we start to kind of enhance the database and start to understand these patterns across these other kinds of uses. That's where you start getting into some very interesting issues. In places where there's fewer species available, do you see more of one kind of use than another kind of use? Do you see more cosmology and less kind of technology-related uses? So there's many questions you can start to ask across these different systems, and both diving deep within particular systems and then cross-cutting. And Stephanie can say more about that too. Everything I'm talking about at this very end is stuff that you should talk to Stephanie about, because she'll be around, and this is a lot. She's deeply, deeply involved in helping to lead this effort. One interesting thing that comes out that we're starting to look at also is particular species often have many uses. For example, breadfruit in French Polynesia the fruit's used for food in different kinds of ways. It's also used as pig fodder. The sap is used both for medicines and making different kinds of tools. Wood is used for structures and for ritualistic purposes and for fuel. Bark for clothing, leaves for medicines, fruit and bark are also used for trade and taxation purposes. And this is you can start to see, across different systems, what are the species that are getting used in a lot of different kinds of ways. Many species may only have fairly specialized uses, but a lot of them are going to have, many different kinds of uses. So, one of the things that Stephanie pulled together was just graphs to basically look at some of the dominant multi-use species for particular systems. And here, again, there's many ways we can potentially slice and dice this and start to ask questions. So these are the species that are highly used. The red are the ones that are introduced, in this case by the Polynesians, and blue is the indigenous sort of taxon. It's another story. But this just shows all the different kinds of uses spreading out, where all the uses are right over here. And not surprisingly, their high-use things are the things they brought with them, because they brought those things with them because they were incredibly useful. But in some systems, it's not the case that they brought things with them for different kinds of reasons. So, for example, the Northwest Coast, the top use species, things like cedar, herring, dog, whale, salmon, mussel, they're indigenous taxa, and many of them are marine, actually. You could do a marine terrestrial breakout. Western desert of Australia also, because, the landscape is one that has always had humans on it. In southwestern US, it's mostly indigenous taxa, but then maize is the biggest, is a giant one, of course, is incredibly important for many reasons. Iceland is more evenly split. Moran, again, we already talked about. So we're just starting to get the data to a point where we can start to play around with it. We still have quite a bit to do on the data side, but we're just starting to kind of figure out and conceptualize how we can look at this data to get at some of these very interesting questions that we started to talk about in the context of the working group. The last thing I'll just wrap up with is something I'm incredibly fascinated with, and I think other people are getting excited about. And it's what I call simple versus complex interactions. And so I'll give two examples. So in Moray, French Polynesia, if a human is hungry for a banana and the banana happens to be, it's the right season for it, they can go out and pluck a banana, they can open it, and they can eat it. Very simple. It's not really mediated, although that's also misleading because there's a lot of farming that goes into making it happen, but just ignore that for now. Human eating a breadfruit, you have to process the breadfruit, and you have to involve a lot of other species to make fuel, to create a fire. You have to use leaves to wrap it. You have to pound it into a paste. You have to do all these things in order to get humans eat breadfruit. So two species in each case, human, banana, one link between them. Human eats banana, fairly simple. Human eats breadfruit, much more complex. There's a whole complex of interactions and species that you need in order to instantiate that single feeding link between them. So here's one more example. So this is in the Northwest Coast of North America. Human eats berries. Again, humans can go out And if a berry's there and the berry's ripe, they can pluck it and eat it. Of course, if you want to take berries back, you have to start using technologies, but ignore that bucket for now. You're just out eating the berries. Human eats whale is a whole other story. This is perhaps the most complex of complex interactions across all the systems that we're looking at right now. And again, we're just barely starting to figure out how to characterize all this, but Jacob Earnshaw, who's working with Ian McKechnie up in this system, he basically put together this flow diagram, which you can't read, you should be able to. But at each terminus is a species and information about the species. And then it basically shows, the green shows it's a terrestrial origin or marine origin. And then it shows what kind of technology it was used for, or in this case, this is all ritual preparations. This is all associated equipment and technologies. This is clothing that's needed in order to hunt whales, and this is the canoe and associated technologies. It's a hugely complex network that's supporting this one interaction between humans and whales. If we just go and focus in on making a canoe part of it, even without doing anything, doing something very simple and naive, what are the animals that were used just in terms of trying to make canoes, in terms of the tools and technologies? You have a whole list of mussels and then a bunch of elk, bear, deer, salmon, spawn, mollusks, mammals. A dozen or so different kinds of plants, mostly trees, but other kinds of things. And then were used in a variety of different ways to create different kinds of technologies that were then used in order to create canoes. And one of the cool things that one of the papers that is being finished up out of this particular system, kind of using this approach, is to basically quantify the degree to which humans in this system who lived on the coast were using terrestrial organisms in complex ways in order to access marine animals as food. So it's a really, that's just one example of one diving deep within a particular system kind of study that's going on, and there's many others that are in the works. And I'm just about done. So humans and food webs, obviously as species go extinct, food webs are unraveling, and they're getting more simplified, they're less robust to perturbations. Humans are not always an external negative forcing factor, however. They're a part of food webs. We talked about the different kinds of roles they play. They're not at the top of their food webs. We obviously have many examples of major negative socio-ecological change, but there's also really cool examples of where humans are an integral part of a very healthy, robust ecosystem. Stephanie's work that was featured in the New York Times recently talks about one really compelling case of that with the Mardu people, so ask her about that. And then beyond food webs, we are embarking on this new research agenda about how humans interact with biodiversity through space and time. It's the first time anybody's thought to compile or tried to compile this kind of data comprehensively. There's a ton of data out there. We're just trying to bring it together. We're particularly interested in kind of how these patterns in use across systems and through time relate to the ecological context, the environmental context, and the human cultural context. And and then I think this whole issue at the end of simple versus complex interactions, that's going to provide a really new and interesting way to quantify and model and think about human technology use, human innovation, and comparing it across cultures in the context of these other kind of constraints and opportunities. And I'll end there, but thank you for your time and for inviting me out to CRI. And I know it's time for people to go, so whoever needs to go.
No, it's actually time for questions, for open questions, because there are, I think, a lot of questions. At least I have a lot of questions, but
Go.
maybe we can let other people to ask. No?
Yes. So I understand. I'm interested in that very final question. What we today could learn in terms of sustainability for the future from looking at the past. And there was one thing that you mentioned that I could see that. That's where, if evidently, when humans shift their
switching.
Right. Could you mention some other phenomena?
Yeah, you should feel free to answer any of these questions too.
You pass it up. I think that one of the interesting things about using archaeology for this is that when we can gather this kind of data and look at these kinds of histories and see where sustainability was and where sustainability wasn't in these particular cases, something that can help us do is see the ways in which our modalities with the environment can either be beneficial or not. So for example, with the Mardu case, the fact that using fire for hunting, which is exploitative and extractive, right? You're burning plants and you're taking out lizards, is actually beneficial for the environment as a whole, because you create natural fire breaks for when the wildland fires come through. And so by combining this kind of data and seeing these in a networked way, and then being able to do these kinds of removal analyses, that can show us the ways that humans embed and the ways in which we exploit.
And we also get interesting comparisons even like across some of the French Polynesian islands, Moorea versus Mangareva. Moorea is a fairly sustainable system over the last 1,000 years since humans came in. Mangareva has not been. There's a lot of environmental degradation and species loss, and also human culture also kind of had a chaotic period, and the population dropped. And there's actually a very interesting kind of, story about, and there's differences. Again, this gets to the ecological, environmental context and human cultural context. Moorea is a bigger island. It's got mountains. It's got mountainous terrain that's hard to So humans came to both of these islands and started clearing it for agriculture. In Moorea, they weren't able to just take down all the forests because a lot of forests were protected up in the islands, and they didn't need to because it was big enough relative to the population of humans. In Mangareva, however, they pretty quickly, mostly completely deforested Mangareva. That had huge implications for the local climate, but it had even bigger implications because while they were clearing the trees in order to create agriculture, which they depended on, they also kind of forgot about the fact, or didn't have the foresight intelligence to realize that they needed to have trees of a certain size in order to create canoes, to continue creating canoes through time, that their current canoes would fall apart or rot or whatever. They would have to make new canoes in order to engage in the long-distance trade that was really critical for their local economy. And so with the trees all gone, there came a point where they actually weren't able to engage in that long-term trade, which had devastating consequences for the humans on that island. And then the kind of complete culling of the trees also had bad outcomes for biodiversity and global climate and other things. They also, because they brought rats, that had a big impact, more of an impact on Mangareva than it did on Moorea for different reasons. So it's this comparison that you can get particular interesting stories from within systems, like the Mardu or the Aleut, but it's also these comparisons become very powerful because then we can start to tease apart why did that one have less degradation problems than this one. So that's what we'll be driving at.
We're working on a paper right now that we nicknamed "Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good Food Webs?" that kind of looks at these and tries to figure out where those tipping points are, essentially. Because in some cases you can kind of see them, and in some cases you can't. In the South Pacific also, there's examples of some islands, people getting rid of pigs, even though they're eating them. And they're important for their ritual because people were competing with pigs for fodder. And they recognized that was actually having some detriment on society. So they top-down decision killed them all, which
it was actually a bottom-up decision.
Oh.
The chiefs did not institute it. All the people.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
Awesome.
it's great. But that's an example, within the same kind of people on these, islands nearby. In one case, they had incredible foresight intelligence of we need to stop having pigs on the island, even though we value that for our food and rituals. But in another case, on Mangareva, they didn't have the kind of foresight intelligence to realize that they were wiping out these big trees that they needed for canoes. Yeah.
I have a small question. And actually, can this influence from climate, for example, be encoded in your dynamics of your system as loss of links? Does it make sense for you? Because loss of links. Because because me actually, I'm interested in the percolation of networks, but when you actually remove, for example, links, which is completely different phenomena from theoretical physics perspective than loss of nodes, for example. And yeah, does it make sense to remove?
Yeah, I mean, potentially there, I mean, you can
Like-
think of situations where you might have species coexisting but not feeding on each other at one point, not at another. I mean, that's what it would be. I mean, the other thing, of course, is as you lose species, you're losing all the links associated with those species, and that has its own ripple effect.
Okay.
So I mean, if you lose, and the kind of relative position of specialization and generalization within a food web, so where you have very few links or very many links to other species in particular kinds of ways, how those are arranged within, the network and how they are lost from the network, obviously is going to have a big impact on how much you see cascading effects. So.
Yeah.
So actually, something we worked on in Boston was looking vertical networks that the network representation was allowing to get insights on perturbations, curves, and things like that, and that you didn't need so much of the dynamics to really understand the system. I don't know how much work has been done on the vertical networks to disentangle the need for dynamics and just the need for structure.
Well, I mean, the need for dynamics in looking at, so kind of network structure robustness studies, like the very simple ones, that I did with other people did a long time ago, they only capture bottom-up dynamics, or bottom-up robustness dynamics. So, pulling a top predator out of the ecological network doesn't then imply anything in terms of, unless you account for dynamics. So I think you can capture kind of the minimal sort of bottom-up perturbations as you pluck nodes out and account for this species just lost all of its food prey, therefore it's going to go extinct. But you have to get to a dynamical framework in order to start getting at both the top-down and bottom-up effects. And so people like my colleague Uli Broza, who's in Germany at IDIV, his group has done a lot of work to look at dynamics and robustness and persistence of species in order to get at this more complex picture of, getting beyond the kind of, I think network structure can tell you a lot, but it's limited, of course. And it's like, so you have to ask the right questions of it and not ask it to do things that it's not equipped to do.
Yeah, because I was just thinking, like, I heard you talk about it, and they've got a bottom-up approach. But if you think about the Yellowstone situation where wolves were removed, so the whole ecosystem was changed.
Exactly, from the top down.
Exactly. So
Yeah, the removal of top predators has enormous impacts on the ecosystem. Yellowstone is an awesome example of that. You completely change the plant community when you remove wolves or when you reintroduce wolves because you completely change the population dynamics of the mega herbivores.
yeah, but I agree, it's quite hard to forecast or to predict what will happen with food webs if you start interacting with the top layer of the food web.
Yeah, that's where the dynamics is really important. And also just particular, that's also where I think case studies can be really valuable on the empirical side of, really understanding the Yellowstone ecosystem well and showing. And even deer populations exploding in many kinds of places. On the east coast of the U.S., and I don't know what they're doing over here, but that has very obvious implications because there's no top predators. But now humans are being asked to come in and cull them. So there's hunting programs to, basically reintroduce a top predator effect to control the herbivore population so that they're not mowing down and completely changing all the plant communities.
Another example, sorry, I'm Dutch. So I can give another example from Holland.
Yeah.
We have a small area, or there is a small area in Holland where nature was set free.
Yeah.
So, right, nice.
It was just kind of walled off and no human and.
Yeah, exactly. But they also introduced deer.
Why?
But because deers were part of the ecosystem, they thought it would be good to have them. So we make a complete picture when we throw in deers.
Right. Did they throw wolves into it?
No, because the wolves were extinct. So there were no wolves. So at the moment, and then you get the sociological effect that people were against shooting off the deers because the deers were overpopulated.
Yeah.
And so much ecological stress on the area that they were starved to death in winter.
Yeah.
So And that's where you see a sociological problem occurring, that they have a cuddle factor. So you can't shoot deer,
Yeah.
but you don't like them seeing death up the
Right.
road being starved.
So there's so in one of our study areas, the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, I got to go on this sailing expedition on the Haida Gwaii archipelago near the sites, which is basically a part of the area that's being researched by colleagues of ours. And Spencer Wood, my colleague, was a part of that trip. And so I got to go see actually one of these. So deer were introduced to some of these islands, First Nations